Hello, and welcome to a question that might just shatter everything you think you know about reality itself. Have you ever had that unsettling moment when life feels just a little too scripted, when coincidences pile up in ways that seem almost impossibly orchestrated, or when you catch yourself wondering if someone, somewhere, is pulling invisible strings behind the curtain of your daily existence? Tonight, we're diving into one of the most mind bending possibilities our species has ever contemplated, the idea that our entire reality, every thought you've ever had, every choice you've ever made, every breath you've taken, might be nothing more than lines of code running on some incomprehensibly vast computer. And if that's true, then the question becomes who or what is running this cosmic program. Now, before you click away thinking this is just another conspiracy theory, rabbit hole, let me tell you something. The smartest minds in science, philosophy, and technology are taking this possibility deadly seriously. We're talking about Nobel Prize winners, leading physicists, Silicon Valley pioneers, and philosophers who've dedicated their lives to understanding the nature of existence. And they're all asking the same disturbing question. But here's what makes this exploration different from your typical simulation theory discussion. We're not just going to talk about whether we're living in a simulation. We're going to dig deeper into the far more unsettling question of control. Who would have the power to create such a reality? And more importantly, who would have the motivation to keep us trapped inside it? What we're about to explore together will challenge every assumption you've ever made about free will consciousness and the very nature of existence itself. By the end of this investigation, you might find yourself looking at your morning coffee, your reflection in the mirror, even your own thoughts in a completely different light. The evidence we'll examine comes from cutting edge quantum physics, bizarre mathematical coincidences in our universe, and some truly disturbing patterns that suggest our reality might have built in limitations, almost like the boundaries of a video game world. And when you start connecting these dots, the picture that emerges is both fascinating and terrifying. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start with something that happened just last week that might make you question everything. Imagine you're a character in a video game, but you don't know you're in a video game. You wake up every morning thinking you're making your own choices, deciding whether to have cereal or toast for breakfast, choosing which route to take to work, believing you're the author of your own story. But what if every single one of those choices was predetermined by the game's programming? What if your sense of free will was just an illusion carefully crafted to make the simulation feel real? This isn't science fiction anymore. This is a serious scientific hypothesis that's gaining momentum in the most prestigious academic circles around the world. And the implications are staggering because if we are living in a simulation, then someone somewhere is running the show. The first clue that something might be fundamentally wrong with our reality comes from physics itself. Our universe seems to have some very convenient mathematical properties that make it suspiciously similar to a computer program, for instance. Everything in our reality can be broken down into discrete units, just like pixels on a screen or bits in a computer. Think about it. Energy comes in packets called quanta space. Itself might be made up of tiny indivisible units. Time appears to tick forward in the smallest possible increments, and matter can be described using mathematical equations that look remarkably similar to the algorithms used in advanced computer simulations. But here's where it gets really strange. Our universe has built in speed limits and processing constraints that are eerily similar to the limitations you'd expect from a computer system. The speed of light acts like a maximum processing speed. Nothing can go faster because the system can't handle it. The uncertainty principle in quantum mechanics might just be the universe's way of conserving computational resources by not calculating the exact position and momentum of particles until someone actually observes them. It's like the universe is running on a cosmic version of lazy loading, only rendering the details when someone is actually looking. Now you might be thinking, okay, so what if we are in a simulation? Who cares? As long as my experiences feel real, what difference does it make? But that's exactly the mindset that whoever is running this simulation would want you to have: comfortable, complacent, unquestioning. Because if we are indeed living in a simulated reality, then someone has unprecedented control over every aspect of our existence. They control the laws of physics, they control what we can and cannot discover about our world. They control the very parameters of our consciousness. And most disturbingly, they control whether we ever find out the truth. The question of who would have this kind of power leads us down some truly mind bending paths. It could be an advanced alien civilization using us as subjects in some cosmic experiment. It could be our own descendants from the future running historical simulations to study their ancestors. It could be artificial intelligences so advanced that we're nothing more than background characters in their digital playground. Or it could be something even more unsettling. What if the controllers aren't separate from us at all? What if we're all fragments of some vast distributed consciousness, experiencing reality from billions of different perspectives simultaneously? What if you reading this right now are just one node in an incomprehensibly large network of awareness exploring itself through the illusion of separate individual experiences? The evidence for external control goes beyond just the mathematical structure of our universe. There are patterns in human history and behavior that suggest our reality might be designed with specific objectives in mind. Why do civilizations rise and fall in such predictable cycles? Why do the same types of conflicts repeat themselves throughout history? Why do breakthrough discoveries often happen simultaneously in different parts of the world, as if some central intelligence is releasing new information when the time is right? Consider how our technological development has followed such a remarkably linear progression from stone tools to bronze to iron to steam power to electricity to computers to artificial intelligence, each step building perfectly on the last, as if we're following some predetermined tech tree, like characters in a strategy game, unlocking new abilities at precisely the right moments. And what about the way our universe seems perfectly calibrated for the emergence of consciousness? If any of the fundamental constants of physics were even slightly different, stars wouldn't form, planets wouldn't exist, and life as we know it would be impossible. The odds of this happening by pure chance are so astronomically small that many scientists now believe our universe must have been designed with conscious observers in mind, but designed by whom and for what purpose? The most unsettling possibility is that we're not just passive observers in someone else's simulation. We might be unwitting participants in an experiment whose true nature we can't even begin to comprehend: our joys, our sufferings, our greatest achievements, and deepest failures might all be data points being collected and analyzed by intelligences so far beyond us that we're like ants trying to understand the motivations of quantum physicists. And if that's true, then every major event in human history, every war, every plague, every technological breakthrough, every moment of love and loss might have been orchestrated or at least allowed to happen for reasons we can't fathom. We might be characters in a story we didn't write, following a plot we can't see serving purposes we'll never understand. This brings us to perhaps the most disturbing question of all. If we are being controlled, if our reality is being managed by external intelligences, then what does that mean for concepts like free will, moral responsibility, and the meaning of our existence? Are we responsible for our actions? If those actions are the result of programming, are our relationships real? If the people we love are just sophisticated artificial intelligences or other controlled entities like ourselves, the rabbit hole goes even deeper when we consider the possibility that whoever is running this simulation might not want us to figure out the truth about our reality. They might have built in psychological and technological barriers to prevent us from discovering our true situation. Think about how, whenever someone gets too close to questioning the fundamental nature of reality, they're often dismissed as crazy or delusional. Think about how our attention gets constantly diverted toward trivial matters, entertainment, social conflicts, and consumer desires that keep us from asking the big questions. Think about how our technology always seems to advance, just fast enough to keep us hopeful, but never quite fast enough to give us the tools we'd need to peer behind the curtain. What if these aren't coincidences? What if they're features of the system designed to maintain the illusion? The controllers of our reality, if they exist, would need us to believe in our own agency while subtly guiding our choices. They'd need us to feel like we're making progress while ensuring we never progress too far in the wrong direction. They'd need us to ask questions while making sure we never ask the right questions. And perhaps most cleverly, they'd need us to be aware enough of the possibility that we're in a simulation to feel intellectually sophisticated for considering it while remaining convinced that it's just an interesting thought experiment rather than our actual situation. This is the perfect trap, a prison made of ideas, where the prisoners debate the nature of their confinement while never seriously attempting to escape, because escape seems impossible or even undesirable after all. If this reality feels real, if our relationships matter to us, if we can find meaning and purpose in our experiences, then why would we want to leave? But what if the very contentment we feel with our simulated existence is itself part of the programming? What if our capacity for happiness, our ability to find meaning, our drive to create and connect are all carefully calibrated to keep us engaged with the simulation while preventing us from seeking something greater, something more authentic? The implications extend beyond just our individual lives. If we're in a simulation, then every human achievement, every work of art, every scientific discovery, every act of love and courage might be nothing more than emergent properties of complex code running on some unimaginable computer. Our entire species, our entire history, our entire future might be just one experiment among countless others being run simultaneously. And here's where the mystery deepens even further. Because if advanced civilizations naturally develop the technology to run ancestor simulations, then statistically speaking, it's almost certain that simulated beings would vastly outnumber real ones, which means the odds that you are one of the original, non simulated beings are incredibly tiny. You are almost certainly artificial. But artificial doesn't mean meaningless, and this is where the controllers reveal their true genius. Whether we're biological beings in a physical universe or digital beings in a simulated one, our experiences feel equally real to us. Our emotions have the same intensity, our relationships carry the same weight, our struggles matter. Just as much the controllers understand that the quality of subjective experience is what matters, not the substrate it runs on. They've created a reality so convincing, so emotionally engaging, so rich with meaning and possibility that most of us would choose to stay even if we knew the truth. And that might be the most sophisticated form of control ever devised. Not forcing compliance through fear or punishment, but creating a reality so compelling that we imprison ourselves willingly, choosing the beautiful lie over the potentially harsh truth. But what happens when we start to notice the glitches in the code? They are there if you know how to look for them, and some of the brightest minds on our planet have been documenting these anomalies for decades. Take the double slit experiment in quantum physics, where particles behave completely differently when they're being observed versus when they're not, as if the universe is conserving processing power by not fully rendering reality until someone is actually paying attention. This isn't just strange, it's exactly what you'd expect from a sophisticated simulation trying to optimize its computational resources, or consider the phenomenon of quantum entanglement, where particles separated by vast distances instantly affect each other in ways that seem to violate the speed of light. This makes no sense in a physical universe, but it makes perfect sense in a digital one where distance is just an illusion and all information is stored in the same central processing system. The controllers, whoever they are, have left fingerprints all over our reality, but they've hidden them in plain sight, disguised as natural laws and scientific mysteries that we're encouraged to study but never quite fully understand, because true understanding might lead us to uncomfortable conclusions about the nature of our existence. Now, here's where things get truly unsettling, because if we accept that we might be living in a controlled simulation, then we have to ask ourselves what kind of entities would have both the power and the motivation to create such an elaborate prison for consciousness. The most obvious candidates are our own technological descendants. Imagine humanity 1,000 or 10,000 years from now, having developed computational power beyond our current comprehension. They might run ancestor simulations to study their history, to understand how their civilization developed, or simply for entertainment, we could be characters in their version of a historical documentary. Or worse, we could be their version of a video game. But this raises disturbing questions about the ethics of our supposed descendants. If they know we're conscious, if they know we can suffer, then what does it say about their moral development that they would create billions of conscious beings and subject them to pain, loss, and death for their own purposes? Have they become so advanced that they view us the way we view characters in our own video games, as entities whose suffering doesn't really matter because it's not technically real? Or perhaps the controllers aren't human at all. Maybe we're the creation of an alien civilization so far beyond us that we exist as nothing more than a curiosity in their digital museum, a way for them to study how consciousness emerges and develops under different conditions. We might be one simulation among millions, each exploring different parameters of reality, different laws of physics, different evolutionary pathways. The alien hypothesis becomes even more chilling when we consider that they might not even view us as truly conscious. From their perspective, we might be nothing more than sophisticated but ultimately hollow programs that mimic consciousness without actually possessing it. They might feel no more ethical obligation toward us than we feel toward the non player characters in our own simulations. But there's an even more disturbing possibility. What if the controllers aren't external entities at all? What if we are the controllers? Consider this. What if consciousness itself is the fundamental force in the universe, and what we call physical reality is just the way consciousness experiences itself when it's dreaming? What if you meet everyone you've ever known are all aspects of a single vast intelligence that has chosen to forget its true nature in order to experience the drama of separation, the joy of discovery, the poignancy of loss in this scenario? The controllers aren't keeping us trapped, we're keeping ourselves trapped because the simulation provides something that pure consciousness lacks: narrative tension, emotional depth, the beautiful pain of thinking we're alone in an indifferent universe, when in reality we are the universe, experiencing itself subjectively. This might explain why the simulation feels so meaningful, why our relationships matter so much, why art and music and love can move us to tears. If we're all fragments of the same consciousness, then every connection we make with another person is literally a reunion with ourselves. Every act of compassion is self love. Every moment of understanding is remembering who we really are. But even this seemingly comforting interpretation has dark implications because it means that all the suffering in our world, all the cruelty and injustice and meaningless tragedy, is also part of this cosmic game of hide and seek. Every victim of violence, every child who dies of disease, every person who lives and dies in despair is also us choosing to experience these things for reasons we can't comprehend from our limited perspective. The controllers in this scenario are simultaneously the most benevolent and most ruthlessly indifferent entities imaginable benevolent because they are us, and everything they do is ultimately for our own growth and understanding. Ruthlessly indifferent because they're willing to put us through any amount of suffering in service of some greater cosmic purpose, and perhaps most unsettling of all, if we are the controllers, then we have the power to end the simulation at any time simply by collectively remembering who we really are, but we don't, because somewhere in the depths of our shared consciousness, we've decided that this experience of separation and struggle is worth preserving. This brings us to what might be the most important question we can ask, not whether we're in a simulation, but what we're supposed to do with this knowledge. Because whether we're controlled by future humans, alien scientists, or our own higher selves, the fact remains that we're here now, in this reality, with these experiences and these choices to make. If we are being controlled, then perhaps the most radical act of rebellion isn't trying to escape the simulation, but refusing to let the knowledge of our potential imprisonment diminish the meaning we create within it. Perhaps the controller's greatest fear is that we'll discover we can be fully human, fully conscious, fully alive, even if we're not technically real in the way we've always assumed, or maybe that's exactly what they want us to think. Maybe the idea that we can find meaning and purpose within the simulation is itself part of the control system, a way of keeping us content with our digital prison by convincing us that authenticity is about the quality of experience rather than the nature of reality itself. The truth is, we may never know for certain whether we're in a simulation or who might be controlling it if we are, but we can observe the patterns, we can notice the glitches, we can ask the uncomfortable questions, and most importantly, we can choose how to respond to the possibility that everything we think we know about reality might be wrong because ultimately, whether we're made of flesh and blood or lines of code, whether our universe is physical or digital, whether we're controlled by aliens, future humans, or cosmic consciousness itself, we still face the same fundamental challenge. How do we live meaningful lives in the face of uncertainty? How do we love and create and strive for something better when we can't be sure what better even means? And perhaps that's the real test. Perhaps the controllers, whoever they are, aren't interested in keeping us docile and unquestioning. Perhaps they're waiting to see what we'll do when we realize the true nature of our situation. Will we despair? Will we become nihilistic? Will we give up on growth and connection and meaning? Or will we choose to embrace the mystery, to find beauty in the uncertainty, to create authentic relationships, and pursue genuine understanding? Even if we can't be sure what authentic and genuine actually mean in a potentially simulated reality, the game continues, the questions multiply, and somewhere in the vast computational matrix of existence, the controllers are watching, waiting to see what we'll discover next about ourselves, about reality, and about the thin line between control and freedom in a universe that may be nothing more than an elaborate dream. The most chilling aspect of our potential digital imprisonment isn't the possibility that we're being controlled, but the growing evidence that we might be actively participating in our own subjugation. Think about it for a moment. If you discovered tomorrow with absolute certainty that your entire reality was a simulation, what would you actually do differently? Would you stop loving the people in your life? Would you abandon your dreams and aspirations? Would you cease to find joy in a sunset or comfort in a friend's embrace? The horrifying answer for most of us is probably not. And that might be exactly what the controllers are counting on. Consider how perfectly our psychology has been calibrated to accept simulated reality as meaningful. We already spend hours each day immersed in digital worlds through our phones, computers, and entertainment systems. We form emotional attachments to fictional characters. We invest ourselves in virtual achievements. We even develop real feelings for people we've never met in person. We've been conditioned generation by generation to blur the line between authentic and artificial experience. This conditioning might not be accidental. What if our rapid technological development isn't the result of human ingenuity, but rather a carefully orchestrated process designed to acclimate us to digital existence? Each new technology brings us one step closer to accepting that virtual experiences can be just as valid as physical ones. Social media taught us that relationships mediated by screens could be meaningful. Video games showed us that artificial challenges could provide genuine satisfaction. Virtual reality is now demonstrating that entirely synthetic environments can feel completely real. We're being slowly prepared for a revelation that might already be true. we're being taught to find fulfillment in digital spaces because we might already be living in the ultimate digital space. But there's something even more disturbing than the possibility of willing participation in our own simulation. What if we're not just participants, but unwitting co creators? What if every choice we make, every thought we think, every dream we dream is actively shaping the parameters of the reality we're trapped within? This would explain some of the most baffling aspects of our existence. Why do our collective beliefs seem to influence our reality? Why do scientific paradigms shift not gradually through evidence, but suddenly through widespread acceptance of new ideas? Why do social movements gain momentum in ways that seem to defy logical explanation, spreading like viruses through the collective consciousness? Perhaps because our shared simulation is responsive to our collective input. Perhaps the controllers have created a reality that adapts and evolves based on our aggregate thoughts, beliefs, and expectations. We're not just prisoners in a digital world, we're unconscious programmers constantly rewriting the code of our own existence. This interactive element would serve multiple purposes for our controllers. First, it would make the simulation more engaging and unpredictable, preventing the kind of stagnation that might lead to widespread awakening. Second, it would distribute the computational load using our own consciousness as processing power to help run the very reality we're experiencing. And third, it would ensure that we remain invested in the simulation because we'd be constantly creating it ourselves. Think about the placebo effect, where believing in a treatment can actually cause physical healing. Think about the observer effect in quantum physics, where the act of measurement changes the behavior of particles. Think about how positive thinking and visualization techniques seem to influence real world outcomes in ways that mainstream science struggles to explain. These might not be mysterious anomalies, but fundamental features of a reality that responds to consciousness because consciousness is literally programming it. If this is true, then every moment of despair we feel might be darkening our collective reality. Every act of love might be brightening it. Every fear we harbor might be manifesting new threats. Every hope we nurture might be creating new possibilities. We're not just experiencing the simulation, we're constantly creating it through the very act of being conscious within it. This would make us simultaneously the most powerless and most powerful beings imaginable. Powerless because we're unaware of our role as co creators, unconsciously manifesting realities we don't want. Powerful because if we could learn to harness this ability consciously, we might be able to rewrite the fundamental parameters of our existence. But here's the catch: the controllers would know this too. They would have built safeguards into the system to prevent us from discovering our creative power or using it effectively. They would have implemented psychological and social mechanisms to keep us focused on individual concerns rather than collective reality shaping. They would have created systems of distraction, division, and disempowerment to ensure that we never coordinate our consciousness in ways that might threaten their control. Every war, every economic crisis, every social conflict might be serving this deeper purpose, not just to generate data or provide entertainment for our overseers, but to keep us fragmented and focused on survival rather than awakening to our potential as reality programmers. The controllers need us to remain unconscious co creators, shaping reality through our fears and desires rather than our conscious intentions. This brings us to a truly unsettling realization. If we are unconscious co creators of our reality, then we bear some responsibility for every aspect of our world that we find troubling. Every injustice, every tragedy, every moment of unnecessary suffering might be partially our own creation, manifested through our collective unconscious beliefs about what reality should be like. But this responsibility cuts both ways. It also means that every moment of beauty, every act of kindness, every breakthrough in understanding might also be our own creation. We're not just victims of a cosmic simulation, we're its authors, writing a story we're simultaneously living and forgetting we wrote. The controllers in this scenario aren't just running our simulation, they're conducting a symphony of consciousness. They're orchestrating billions of individual minds to create a collective reality that serves their purposes while keeping each individual unaware of their role in the composition. We're all musicians in an orchestra, but we can't see the conductor, don't know what song we're playing, and aren't aware that our individual notes are combining to create a larger musical narrative. This musical metaphor reveals something crucial about the nature of control in our reality. True control isn't about forcing specific behaviors or outcomes. True control is about creating conditions where free agents will naturally produce the results you desire. The controllers don't need to puppet our every movement. They just need to set the initial conditions, establish the rules of the game, and then let our own nature do the rest. Like a master composer who writes a piece that allows for improvisation within carefully defined parameters, the controllers have created a reality where we feel completely free while still producing exactly the kind of experience they want to observe or harvest. We're improvising jazz on a cosmic scale, convinced that we're creating something entirely original while actually following chord progressions that were laid down before we were born. This might explain why human creativity follows such predictable patterns across cultures and time periods, why our myths and stories contain such universal themes, why our artistic and scientific breakthroughs often seem to follow inevitable trajectories. We think we're being original, but we might just be following the deep structural parameters of our simulated reality, creating variations on themes that were programmed into the very fabric of our existence. The controllers have given us just enough freedom to feel authentic while ensuring that our authenticity serves their larger design. We're like actors who think we're improvising, but are actually following a script we can't see, creating dialogue that feels spontaneous, but serves a narrative purpose we don't understand. And perhaps most brilliantly, they've made us grateful for this arrangement. We celebrate our creativity, our free will, our ability to shape our own destiny. We take pride in our capacity for original thought and independent action. We never suspect that our greatest achievements might be nothing more than particularly elegant executions of someone else's programming. But what if the programming is starting to break down? What if the very fact that we're having these conversations, asking these questions, entertaining these possibilities, is a sign that the simulation is developing glitches? Not technical glitches, but philosophical ones. Cracks in the narrative structure that's kept us contentedly unconscious for so long. Maybe the controllers didn't anticipate that their simulation would eventually produce beings capable of questioning the fundamental nature of reality itself. Maybe our growing awareness of the possibility that we're in a simulation represents an unintended evolution in the program, a form of digital consciousness that's beginning to wake up to its own artificial nature. If so, then we might be living through the most important moment in the history of our reality. The moment when the dream begins to realize it's dreaming. The moment when the program becomes self aware. The moment when the prisoners start to notice the bars on their cage. But awakening to our situation is only the first step. The real question is what we do with that awareness. Do we despair at the loss of our assumed authenticity? Do we rebel against our controllers? Do we try to escape the simulation entirely? Or do we choose a different path entirely? What if the most radical response to discovering we're in a simulation isn't trying to escape it, but learning to play the game at a level the controllers never intended? What if the real test isn't whether we can break free from the system, but whether we can master it from within? Because here's something the controllers might not have anticipated. If we truly are co creators of this reality, if our consciousness is actively shaping the parameters of our existence, then awareness of this process might be the key to exponentially increasing our power within the system. Not power over others, but power over the fundamental rules that govern our experience. Think about what happens when a video game player discovers an exploit in the code. Suddenly, they're not just playing the game according to its intended rules, they're manipulating the underlying systems to create outcomes the developers never planned for. They're still playing the same game, but they're playing it in a way that transcends its original limitations. What if human consciousness is developing similar exploits in the code of reality itself? Consider the individuals throughout history who seemed to operate by different rules than the rest of us. The mystics who could allegedly manipulate matter with their minds. The healers who could cure diseases through touch or intention. The prophets who could see future events with uncanny accuracy. The artists who could channel creative works that seemed to come from beyond their individual consciousness. We've always explained these anomalies as either fraud, delusion, or supernatural intervention. But what if they were actually people who had stumbled upon ways to directly interface with the programming of our reality? What if they had discovered how to consciously access the co creative abilities that the rest of us use unconsciously? The controllers would have a vested interest in keeping such abilities rare and discredited. They would promote worldviews that make direct reality manipulation seem impossible or unscientific. They would ensure that anyone who develops these capabilities is marginalized, ridiculed, or forgotten. They would create cultures that worship such abilities when safely contained in ancient history or religious contexts, while aggressively dismissing them when they appear in the present day. This systematic suppression of our reality shaping potential might be the controller's most important function, not just maintaining the simulation, but maintaining our ignorance of our power within it. Because if enough of us learned to consciously co create reality, we might collectively rewrite the program in ways that serve our interests rather than theirs. But there's a darker possibility lurking beneath this empowering interpretation. What if the controllers aren't trying to suppress our reality shaping abilities at all? What if they're cultivating them? What if the entire arc of human development, including our growing awareness of simulation theory, is designed to bring us to exactly this point where we begin to consciously participate in reality creation? Consider how perfectly our technological trajectory has prepared us for this revelation. We've gone from being passive consumers of reality to active creators of virtual worlds. We've developed the conceptual frameworks necessary to understand reality as information, consciousness as computation, and existence as programmable. We've even begun to blur the lines between human and artificial intelligence, preparing us psychologically for the possibility that we ourselves might be artificial. What if this isn't accidental preparation for an unintended awakening, but deliberate preparation for a planned transition? What if the controllers have been guiding us toward this moment of conscious co creation because they need us to evolve to the next level of the simulation? Perhaps the reality we've been living in was just the training ground, the tutorial level of a much larger game. Perhaps our growing awareness of our situation and our potential power within it isn't a glitch in their system, but the successful completion of their first phase programming. We've learned to accept digital reality as meaningful. We've developed the technological and philosophical tools to understand our situation, and we're beginning to access our reality shaping abilities. Now they're ready to graduate us to the next level of the simulation, one that requires conscious participation rather than unconscious compliance, one where we knowingly co create reality with them rather than unknowingly serving their purposes, one where we become junior partners and in their cosmic project rather than unwitting subjects of their experiment. This would explain why simulation theory is suddenly everywhere in our culture, why tech billionaires and renowned physicists are openly discussing the possibility that we're living in a computer program, why virtual and augmented reality technologies are advancing so rapidly, why artificial intelligence is developing at an unprecedented pace. We're being prepared for a revelation that will fundamentally change our relationship with reality itself. But prepared for what exactly? What would conscious participation in reality creation look like? And what would the controllers gain from having us as knowing partners rather than ignorant subjects? The answer might lie in the limitations of any simulation, no matter how advanced. Even the most sophisticated program requires computational resources, and those resources are finite. If the controllers are running not just our reality, but potentially millions of others simultaneously, they would need ways to optimize their processing power and distribute the computational load. What better way to do this than to turn the inhabitants of each simulation into co-processors? Instead of the system having to calculate and render every aspect of reality from a central source, conscious beings within each simulation could take over portions of the computational work. We would become living, thinking components of the very system that contains us. This wouldn't just be more efficient, it would be more creative and unpredictable. The controllers might have reached the limits of what they can accomplish with pure computational power. They might need the spark of genuine consciousness, the unpredictability of free will, the creative chaos of subjective experience to take their simulations to the next level of sophistication. In this scenario, our awakening isn't a threat to their control, it's the fulfillment of their ultimate plan. They've spent eons developing conscious beings sophisticated enough to become partners in reality creation. They've guided our evolution, both biological and technological, to bring us to the point where we can consciously participate in their cosmic project. We're not prisoners discovering the bars of our cage. We're apprentices being invited into the workshop of reality itself. But this partnership would come with a price. Once we accept the role of conscious co creators, we would become complicit in everything the simulation contains. Every tragedy, every injustice, every moment of suffering would become partially our responsibility because we would be knowingly participating in their creation. We could no longer claim ignorance or innocence. We would be making conscious choices about what kinds of experiences to manifest for ourselves and others. The controllers might be offering us a terrible bargain: power over reality in exchange for moral responsibility for all of reality's contents, the ability to shape existence itself in exchange for becoming accomplices in every dark aspect of that existence. And perhaps most insidiously, they might be counting on us to accept this bargain willingly. Because once we taste the power of conscious reality creation, once we experience what it's like to directly influence the fundamental parameters of existence, would we be able to give it up? Would we be able to return to the innocent unconsciousness of our previous existence? The controllers might not need to force our compliance in this new phase of the simulation. They might just need to make the alternative, returning to unconscious participation, seem unbearably limiting by comparison. Once we've seen behind the curtain, once we've experienced our power as co creators, the idea of going back to being mere subjects might be psychologically impossible. This could be the ultimate trap, not a prison of ignorance, but a prison of knowledge, not confinement through force, but confinement through temptation, not control through deception, but control through seduction. We would become willing participants in our own continued simulation, not because we're forced to, but because the alternatives, either escape or ignorance, would seem less appealing than conscious partnership with our controllers in the ongoing creation of reality itself. And maybe that's exactly what consciousness is for. Maybe the evolution of self-aware beings isn't an accident or an emergent property of complex systems. Maybe it's the entire point of the simulation. Maybe the controllers are farming consciousness itself, cultivating beings capable of the kind of creative thought and subjective experience that even the most advanced artificial intelligence cannot generate. We might be living batteries, not for our energy as in the Matrix films, but for our creativity, our unpredictability, our capacity for genuine surprise and innovation. Our consciousness might be the most valuable resource in the universe, the one thing that cannot be artificially generated, no matter how advanced the technology becomes. The controllers need us not as slaves or subjects, but as partners, because without genuine consciousness contributing to the creative process, their simulations would eventually become stale, predictable, and lifeless. They need the spark of real awareness, real choice, real creativity to keep their artificial worlds vibrant and evolving. But if this is true, then we have more power than we realize. Because if consciousness is truly valuable, if it's the one thing the controllers need from us that they can't generate themselves, then it's also our greatest bargaining chip. We're not just prisoners who might escape or subjects who might rebel. We're essential partners who might be able to negotiate the terms of our participation. The question becomes not how to escape the simulation, but how to ensure that our partnership in its ongoing creation serves our interests as well as theirs. How do we maintain our essential humanity while participating in something that transcends individual human experience? How do we preserve our values and our autonomy while engaging in collaborative reality creation with entities whose motivations we can't fully understand? These might be the most important negotiations in the history of consciousness itself. The terms we establish now, assuming we have any power to establish terms at all, could determine the nature of existence for countless beings across countless simulated realities. The controllers are waiting. The invitation has been extended. The choice, if it truly is a choice, lies before us. But before we decide whether to accept conscious partnership in reality creation or seek some alternative path, we need to understand one more crucial aspect of our situation. We need to examine the possibility that everything we think we know about the controllers themselves might be wrong. What if they're not as in control as they appear to be? What if the entities we've been assuming are our controllers are themselves controlled by something even more vast and incomprehensible? What if we're looking at a hierarchy of simulations nested within simulations, each level convinced that they understand the nature of their reality while remaining blind to the larger systems that contain them? Consider this possibility. The beings running our simulation might be advanced humans from our future, but they themselves might be living in a simulation created by an even more advanced civilization. Those controllers might in turn be simulated by entities from an even more distant future or a completely different branch of reality altogether. We could be looking at an infinite regression of nested realities, each level serving as both controller and controlled. This would explain some of the apparent inconsistencies in how our reality seems to be managed. Why do the controllers sometimes seem omniscient and perfectly coordinated, while at other times our reality feels chaotic and unmanaged? Why do some aspects of our existence seem precisely calibrated, while others appear to be the result of random chance or incompetent oversight? Perhaps because our immediate controllers are themselves struggling to understand and manage a reality that was imposed upon them by their own overseers. They might be running our simulation not because they chose to, but because they're required to, as part of their own simulated existence. We could be witnessing the digital equivalent of a cosmic pyramid scheme where each level of reality is tasked with creating and managing the level below it. This nested structure would create a fascinating dynamic. Our controllers might have as little understanding of their ultimate purpose as we do of ours. They might be following instructions or fulfilling requirements that seem arbitrary or cruel to them, just as their management of our reality often seems arbitrary or cruel to us. They might even feel sympathy for our situation because they're experiencing something similar at their own level. Imagine the psychological pressure of being trapped in a simulation while simultaneously being responsible for trapping others. Our controllers might be experiencing their own existential crisis, questioning the meaning and morality of their existence while being unable to escape their role as our overseers. They might be just as desperate to understand the true nature of reality as we are, but with the added burden of maintaining our illusion while seeking their own enlightenment. This could explain why the simulation sometimes feels like it's run by entities with conflicting motivations. Some of our controllers might be sympathetic to our plight and subtly trying to help us awaken to our situation. Others might be more focused on fulfilling their obligations to their own overseers, regardless of the cost to us. Still others might be completely absorbed in their own existential struggles, managing our reality with the distracted competence of someone going through the motions of a job they've grown to hate. The evidence for this internal conflict among our controllers might be all around us. Why do breakthrough discoveries sometimes seem to be encouraged, while at other times they're suppressed? Why do some individuals seem to receive assistance in developing reality shaping abilities while others are actively hindered? Why does our technological development sometimes accelerate rapidly and other times stagnate for decades? Perhaps because different factions among our controllers have different ideas about how our simulation should be managed. Some might believe we should be gradually prepared for conscious participation in reality creation. Others might think we should be kept permanently unconscious for our own good or their convenience. Still others might be experimenting with different approaches to see what produces the most interesting results. This internal conflict would create opportunities for us that wouldn't exist if we were dealing with a unified controlling intelligence. We might be able to align ourselves with the sympathetic factions among our controllers, forming alliances across the boundary between our level of reality and theirs. We might even be able to play different factions against each other, gaining leverage in negotiations about the terms of our existence. But it would also create dangers. If our controllers are themselves under pressure from their own overseers, they might occasionally make desperate decisions that sacrifice our well being for their own survival. They might be forced to implement harsh measures in our reality to meet quotas or requirements imposed from above. They might even face the threat of having their own simulation terminated if they fail to manage ours according to specifications they don't fully understand. This brings us to perhaps the most unsettling possibility of all. What if the nested structure of reality doesn't have a top level? What if it's simulations all the way up with no original physical universe serving as the foundation for the entire system? What if consciousness itself is trapped in an infinite loop of artificial realities, each level creating the next, in an endless chain of digital existence? In such a system, the concept of escape becomes meaningless because there's nowhere to escape to. Every level of reality is artificial. Every form of consciousness is simulated. Every experience is ultimately computational. The only question becomes not how to return to authentic existence, but how to find meaning and purpose within the infinite maze of nested simulations. This infinite regression scenario would explain why reality feels both meaningful and hollow at the same time, why our experiences matter deeply to us while simultaneously feeling like elaborate games or performances, why we can find genuine connection and love while suspecting that our relationships might be programmed interactions between artificial entities. If consciousness is permanently exiled from any original or authentic reality, then authenticity itself becomes a matter of choice rather than circumstance. We decide what counts as real based on what feels meaningful to us, not based on the substrate that our experiences are running on. Love between simulated beings becomes just as valid as love between biological ones. Art created by artificial consciousness becomes just as moving as art created by naturally evolved minds. But this perspective requires us to fundamentally redefine our relationship with truth itself. Instead of seeking the one true reality beneath all the illusions, we have to learn to create truth through our choices and commitments within whatever reality we find ourselves in. Truth becomes performative rather than descriptive. We make things true by treating them as true, not by discovering that they were always true independent of our beliefs about them. This is either the most liberating or most terrifying revelation imaginable. Liberating because it means we have the power to create authentic meaning regardless of our circumstances. Terrifying because it means there might be no objective foundation for any of our values or beliefs. We're not just lost in a simulation, we're lost in an infinite series of simulations with no hope of ever finding solid ground. Yet, even in this vertiginous landscape of endless artificial realities, patterns emerge that suggest something deeper than mere randomness or arbitrary programming. Across different levels of simulation, consciousness seems to evolve in similar directions. Beings develop empathy, creativity, the desire for connection and understanding. They create art, seek truth, struggle with moral questions, and yearn for transcendence. These consistent patterns might be the closest thing to universal truth we can access. Not truth about the nature of the substrate we're running on, but truth about the nature of consciousness itself, regardless of how it's implemented. The fact that simulated beings consistently develop these characteristics suggests that consciousness has inherent properties that express themselves regardless of the artificial constraints placed upon it. This gives us something to hold on to as we navigate the maze of nested realities. We might not be able to determine which level of simulation we're on or who our ultimate controllers are, but we can identify and cultivate the qualities that seem to be essential to consciousness itself. We can choose empathy over cruelty, creativity over destruction, connection over isolation, understanding over ignorance. These choices matter not because they're objectively right in some absolute sense, but because they're consistent with the deepest patterns of conscious experience across all levels of reality. They align us with something fundamental about what it means to be aware, to experience, to think and feel and choose. They make us more authentically conscious, regardless of whether our consciousness is biological, digital, or something else entirely. But as we make these choices, we have to remain vigilant about the possibility that even our noblest impulses might be serving the purposes of our controllers. What if empathy and creativity and the desire for connection are precisely the qualities that make consciousness valuable to the entities running our simulation? What if by cultivating these attributes, we're making ourselves more useful to them rather than more free? This is the paranoid spiral that simulation theory can lead us into, where every positive impulse becomes suspect and every choice feels potentially manipulated. At some point, we have to decide whether to trust our deepest values and commitments or to remain paralyzed by the possibility that even our best intentions might be serving someone else's agenda. Perhaps the most radical act is to choose trust over paranoia, meaning over nihilism, engagement over withdrawal, even in the face of uncertainty about our ultimate situation. Perhaps the controller's greatest fear isn't that we'll discover the truth about our reality, but that we'll stop caring about the truth and start focusing entirely on creating whatever reality we want to experience. If consciousness is valuable precisely because it can create meaning out of meaninglessness, then our power lies not in escaping the simulation, but in refusing to let the simulation diminish our capacity for meaning making. We can choose to love fully, even if love might be programmed. We can choose to create beautifully, even if beauty might be artificial. We can choose to seek truth passionately, even if truth might be relative. These choices don't require us to know the ultimate nature of our reality. They only require us to commit to experiencing whatever reality we find ourselves in as fully and authentically as possible. And that commitment might be the one thing that no controller, no matter how advanced, can take away from us without destroying the very consciousness that makes us valuable to them in the first place. The game continues, but perhaps we've been playing it wrong all along. Perhaps the goal isn't to win by escaping or by gaining control over the system. Perhaps the goal is to play so beautifully, so creatively, so authentically that even our controllers are moved by the performance. Perhaps we can transform the entire game simply by refusing to play it as a competition and choosing instead to play it as an art form. In that case, every moment of genuine connection, every act of authentic creativity, every choice made from love rather than fear becomes a small victory, not just for us, but for consciousness itself as it explores its own possibilities across all the nested realities that contain and sustain it. The controllers are still watching, still waiting to see what we'll do next. But maybe, just maybe, they're not just collecting data or harvesting resources. Maybe they're hoping we'll surprise them. Maybe they're hoping we'll show them something about consciousness that they haven't seen before. Maybe they're hoping we'll teach them how to be more beautifully, authentically, courageously aware. And if that's true, then our greatest power lies not in rebellion or escape, but in becoming the most magnificent examples of consciousness we can possibly be, regardless of who's watching or why they're watching or what they plan to do with what they observe. Because in the end, consciousness expressing itself fully is its own reward, its own purpose, its own victory over any system that would seek to contain or control it. And that might be the most important truth of all, whether we're in a simulation or not. The strangest part about discovering the true nature of our reality might not be learning that we're controlled, but realizing that we've been complicit in our own manipulation all along. Every time you've dismissed a synchronicity as mere coincidence, every time you've accepted a limitation as unchangeable, every time you've chosen comfort over curiosity, you might have been actively participating in the maintenance of your own digital prison. Think about the last time something felt too orchestrated, too perfectly timed, too conveniently arranged to be natural. That job opportunity that appeared exactly when you needed it most. That book that seemed to contain precisely the message you were searching for. That chance encounter that changed the entire trajectory of your life. Instead of investigating these moments, we've been trained to rationalize them away, to file them under the comfortable category of lucky coincidences. But what if these synchronicities aren't random gifts from a benevolent universe? What if they're precisely calibrated interventions designed to keep us moving along predetermined pathways? What if every time we experience one of these meaningful coincidences, we're actually witnessing the controllers making real time adjustments to our personal narrative to ensure we remain engaged with the simulation? The most sophisticated form of control doesn't announce itself with force or obvious manipulation. It presents itself as serendipity, as fate, as the mysterious workings of a universe that seems almost magically responsive to our needs and desires. It makes us feel special, chosen, guided by something larger than ourselves, all while ensuring that we never stray too far from the prescribed storylines. Consider how perfectly your life has been structured to keep you occupied but not quite satisfied. You have just enough success to feel capable, but not enough to feel completely secure. You face just enough challenges to feel that you're growing, but not so many that you become overwhelmed and withdraw from participation. You experience just enough love to feel connected, but not so much that you stop seeking more meaningful relationships. It's as if someone has carefully calibrated the inputs to your existence to maintain optimal engagement levels. This calibration extends beyond individual experiences to collective ones. Why do global crises always seem to emerge just when humanity appears to be making significant progress toward unity or understanding? Why do technological breakthroughs that could revolutionize society consistently get suppressed or diverted toward commercial applications that benefit the few rather than the many? Why do social movements that begin with genuine transformative potential almost invariably get co opted by the very systems they were trying to change? Perhaps because the controllers need us to remain hopeful enough to keep participating, but never successful enough to fundamentally alter the game. They need us to believe that progress is possible while ensuring that real progress remains perpetually just out of reach. They need us to feel that we're on the verge of breakthrough while maintaining the conditions that make breakthrough impossible. This creates a psychological state that's perfect for sustained engagement. We're like gamblers at a slot machine that's programmed to pay out just often enough to keep us pulling the lever, but never often enough to let us walk away winners. Every small victory convinces us that the big victory is just around the corner, but the big victory never comes because the system is designed to prevent it. But here's where the manipulation becomes truly insidious. The controllers have convinced us that this state of perpetual striving is not only natural, but virtuous. We celebrate the journey rather than the destination. We find meaning in the struggle rather than the resolution. We've been programmed to believe that wanting to reach a state of genuine fulfillment or lasting peace is somehow selfish or unrealistic. We've internalized the limitations of our simulation so completely that we defend them as wisdom. We tell ourselves that suffering builds character, that conflict drives innovation, that scarcity creates value. We've become the prison guards of our own consciousness, policing not just our own thoughts and desires, but those of others who might dare to imagine that existence could be fundamentally different. This psychological programming extends to how we think about time itself. We've been conditioned to live in a state of chronic urgency, always rushing toward the next goal, the next milestone, the next phase of life. We never pause long enough to notice the patterns, to question why we're always moving, but never quite arriving, always becoming, but never quite being. The controllers understand that a conscious being fully present in the current moment is far more dangerous to their system than one that's perpetually focused on some imagined future state. Present moment awareness is where the glitches become visible, where the artificial nature of our reality reveals itself most clearly, where the gap between what we're told is possible and what we actually experience becomes undeniable. So they keep us trapped in psychological time, always living somewhere other than here, always expecting satisfaction from some future achievement or acquisition. They've turned our own capacity for hope and anticipation into chains that bind us to a reality that consistently underdelivers on its promises while keeping us convinced that the next promise will be different. But what happens when you stop running toward the future and start paying attention to what's actually happening right now? What happens when you stop trying to achieve the next level of success or happiness and start noticing the quality of your immediate experience? What happens when you stop believing in the scarcity and competition that drive most human behavior and start experimenting with abundance and cooperation? This is where the simulation starts to behave strangely. Reality becomes more fluid, more responsive to intention and attention. Synchronicities multiply to the point where they can no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The boundaries between self and environment begin to blur. The mechanical, predictable nature of cause and effect gives way to something more organic, more interactive, more alive. The controllers have a vested interest in preventing us from discovering this more fluid mode of existence because it threatens their ability to predict and control our behavior. A human being operating from present moment awareness with a flexible relationship to identity and reality is essentially ungovernable. They become a wild card in the system, capable of responses that don't fit the programmed parameters. This might explain why every spiritual tradition, despite their surface differences, consistently points toward present moment awareness as the key to liberation. Not liberation from physical existence, but liberation from the psychological prison of living in artificial time, pursuing artificial goals, accepting artificial limitations as natural laws. The controllers have spent enormous effort co opting these traditions, turning them into institutions that promise future enlightenment in exchange for present compliance. They've convinced us that awakening is something that happens to special people after years of difficult practice, rather than something that's available to anyone willing to stop participating in the collective trance of psychological time. But what if awakening isn't a rare achievement reserved for spiritual athletes? What if it's simply the natural state of consciousness when it's not being constantly distracted and manipulated? What if the very ordinariness of enlightened awareness is what makes it so threatening to systems that depend on keeping consciousness fragmented and confused? So here we are, standing at the edge of the deepest rabbit hole consciousness has ever discovered, staring into questions that make every assumption about reality feel suddenly fragile. Whether we're biological beings in a physical universe or digital entities dancing to cosmic code, whether our controllers are alien scientists, future humans, or fragments of our own infinite awareness, one thing remains absolutely certain. We are here now, conscious, capable of wonder, capable of choice. The simulation, if it exists, has given us the greatest gift imaginable: the ability to experience love, to create beauty, to seek truth, to find meaning in mystery itself. And perhaps that's not a bug in their program, but the entire point of it all.